We are very happy today to have Congressman Don Bonker with us. Congressman Bonker served 14 years as a member of the U.S. Congress and represented our state in the other Washington. While Don was not born here, you've been here since college, so I guess that qualifies you as a Washingtonian. And he's also a fellow Bainbridge Island resident. Earlier this year, he published a memoir called A Higher Calling, Faith and Politics in the Public Square. And we might have been able to have him in person, but something called COVID-19 intervened. So we're grateful to have you here virtually today. And I will definitely send out a link to your book, which is available in paperback or hardback, I guess, or on Kindle, which is the way I got it. Welcome, Congressman Bonker.
Well, Reed, thank you so much for the invitation, you and the Senior Community Center, and for moderating this session, and also for taking time to read a few chapters so you get a sense of the memoir. That's how it started as a memoir, because I'm thinking of grandchildren, great-grandchildren, long after I disappear. They're going to say, he served in Congress? What was that all about? And that's what motivated me to get started. But a few months later, I was a speaker at an economic forum in Kazakhstan, and one of the other speakers was David Applefield. He was a senior editor at the Financial Times based in Paris. And so we were there for a few days, got acquainted. I shared with him a few of the chapters. When he returned to Paris, he emailed me, said, Don, I want to get involved in your book. And I welcomed him. It took another 9 months or so. But I like to say I had the bones in the book, but he added flesh to the bones. He said, you got to have the serendipities, the episode, the quandaries, all these experiences that really make for a good novel. But you need to have that personal touch. Let me just make a comment about David Applefield, whose name appears on the cover. We were in D.C. Now about 1.5 years ago, and he said, Don, I'm so inspired by your book. I've discussed with my wife, we're moving back to New Jersey. I'm going to run for Congress. So he ran as a candidate in the 4th Congressional District. About 2 months ago, it was a primary election. He placed 3rd. The next day, he died of a heart attack. So that was heart-wrenching. He not only added value to the book, but he became a very close personal friend. So I just want the book to honor him in various ways. Well, then, moving beyond the memoir, it became something of a clarion call for moral leadership. And what sparked that was the contrast between the political environment when I served in Congress compared to what it is today. At that time, there was something of moral leadership. The congressmen and senators, many in the leadership, had character. There was a trust factor. There was reaching over to bipartisan support of various measures. In other words, it really brought out the best in our democracy. And I couldn't help but feel the contrast to what it's like today. And then finally, in my opening comment, the other lesson as I brought out all those boxes and files, and I mean, going back 40, 50 years of my political career, what emerged is the people I saw as role models. So I have a part in the book called Profiles in Character. You remember John Kennedy's book, Profiles in Courage. This was of character. These were political leaders at the high level of character. And of the 8, 4 are from Washington, or from the Northwest, 2 Democrats. They were Scoop Jackson, who was a longstanding U.S. Senator. He ran for president. And Tom Foley, from Spokane, went on to become Speaker. And on the Republican side, Dan Evans, our governor for many years before he was senator, and Mark Hatfield, a senator from Oregon. So those were four, but I honored equally Democrats and Republicans because they all had a profound influence on my life.
I feel like you mentioned Tom Foley, and he definitely was, in many ways, I think, like yourself, a centrist Democrat. And centrism is sort of disappearing as part of this challenge that we have right now. Do I get this right, that you mentioned in the book that you feel as though when he was challenged and lost his speakership, that was kind of a key point in our losing that sort of stateswoman feel of serving in Congress?
A good point, Reed. Tom Foley was tall, handsome, a gentleman, decent. He was known for his character. The Republicans liked him so much. One of them commented, "I wish he were one of us." So he was a moderate, but he was also representing a very conservative district, Eastern Washington. He was rare as a Democrat to represent Eastern Washington. But he served as Speaker. And the contrast I drew in the book is that he was known for civility. And he was replaced in the early 1990s by Newt Gingrich, Republican. And when Gingrich got into the Speaker's chair, instead of a gavel, he had a sledgehammer. And he turned the House into a battlefield. He, in a sense, replaced civility with combativeness. And we have never recovered. It's only gotten worse in the last 4 years, as everybody knows who watches the news.
Yeah, I wonder how much of that is something that we can look to lawmakers to solve, and how much of it is going to be something that we as citizens need to step up and do. Because there are, I've read about the fact that that if you're going to win a primary in many districts now, you have to be on the edge, like in a Democratic seat or a highly blue district, you need to be navy blue. And if you need to be royal red to be winning in a Republican seat, and you aren't going to get many Tom Foleys anymore.
Well, yes, you are. In fact, I saw Joel Connolly, he used to cover politics when I was in Congress and writes for the Post Alley. And he was pointing out how many moderate Democrats from Washington State, we are considered one of the most liberal states, and alongside San Francisco. But when you look at Derek Kilmer, our congressman, he is known for reaching across the aisle. I had, as you know, an article in the paper on him. And then the two or three who serve in Seattle suburbs, Adam Smith and Delbena and Rick Larson, they're all considered moderates. And but the moderates are shrinking when you look at the political spectrum. When I was there, I would say about 60% in the spectrum were moderate Democrats and Republicans. And that's why people could work together to get beyond their differences. 20% were far right, 20% were far left. If you look today, you have about 20% moderates, and you have 40% on the right and 40% on the left. So when you're dealing with the ideology, it's very difficult to find compromise. Finally, if there's anyone who can do it, it's Joe Biden. All those years in the Senate, highly regarded, moderate, but of course feeling a lot of pressure on the progressive side. So he's going to have to navigate. It's going to be a very difficult journey. But if anyone can do it, it would be Joe Biden.
And to the point you just made, that was the nominee for the Democrats,
Yep.
was somebody who pledged to serve every American. So I'm corrected about the idea of centrist or moderate governance. It's still very much
And
possible.
his theme during this transition period has been all about unity. Despite the cheap shots and the difficulties and the potholes, he has tried to maintain a high road, respect for the other side, looking at unifying the nation. That's what we need at this moment.
In your book, you go to some length to talk about your relationship with a man named Douglas Coe, who was the leader of a group called the Fellowship, which I think ran or runs the prayer breakfast.
Yes.
It seems as though definitely we hear from many Republicans running for Congress that faith is a big part of their life. You say it is a big part of your life. Do you think that there's a way that at least that kind of a connection can be rejuvenated? I mean,
Yeah. Well, that's a more complicated question. At the time, we go back about 35, no, almost 40 years before the moral majority came on the scene. And Doug's whole mission on Capitol Hill, and he's from Oregon. He came to Washington, D.C. along with Mark Hatfield. They were close friends. And eventually he became head of the National Prayer Breakfast. It's not a title, it's not a position, but he was kind of the godfather of the prayer breakfast. And his mission on Capitol Hill was to bring Democrats and Republicans together in prayer groups so they could get beyond their differences. And so he invited me and 3 others. So we had 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, and we met faithfully every week that we were in session for the 14 years in Congress. And we met in Mark Hatfield's lovely office on Capitol Hill because as chairman of the Rules Committee, he had some privileges. And so we met faithfully. And as we walked in the door, we set aside all the policies and issues. And we had built a very close relationship, went way beyond the differences. And so close that we were rooting for one another when we ran for higher office. And incidentally, we all ran for higher office the same year. One ran for governor, the other 2 for the U.S. senator. We thought God had given us a destination. We were young and ambitious and attractive, and we felt this was our moment to be victorious, to move to the U.S. Senate or the governor mansion. We all lost. And a week later, we all went to Bermuda to spend a week together to really better understand our situation. That God more or less ordained this and we lost. What's that all about? Well, it's all about defeat. A setback, failure. That's how you build character. You go deeper. And those are the examples in the Old Testament, incidentally. And so we all came to agreement. Maybe this was a necessity. We've had success. We've had a delightful life. But is that how you go deeper? Is that how you build character? And the defeat really set us in a different pathway. And we've all went on to become, I don't know if more successful, but happier than if we had been elected that year.
Yeah,
and incidentally, 40 years later, we still get together. And we still look young, but we're no longer as ambitious.
That's how it goes here at the Senior Community Center too, just so you know.
Let me offer a few comments because I want to get this in before the discussion. The serendipities and other things. One of them was an absentee father. I grew up, my brother and I, without a father. He wasn't there. But there's some interesting references to him. When I decided to go to college in Vancouver, I was in Denver at the time, as you know, a dance instructor, on to Vancouver to go to college. So I won't get into those little serendipities. But again, that was an emotional part that wasn't in the original draft, but David Applefield pulled that out of me. And the other was my wife, Carolyn. I honor her in the book, but by way of these wonderful little stories. And at the time I got to Congress, she was 26 years old. She was the youngest spouse in the Congress. And the Speaker, Tip O'Neill, and everyone referred to her as the Jacqueline Kennedy of the Congress, because she was wonderful, attractive. So let me share one little episode on that, maybe a teaser to get someone to buy the book. When I got to Congress, I ended up on the Foreign Affairs Committee. Again, that was a very awkward situation. I stumbled into it. But once you're on that committee, you get invitations to all these embassy receptions. And this particular one was the Swedish embassy hosting the King of Sweden. He was fairly young, and it was a huge event in Washington, D.C. And we happened to know the ambassador and his wife in a different way, so we ended up on the invitation list. But they had over 200 people, and including some high-level people at this dinner in his honor. So we arrived at the embassy, and the ambassador's wife, she was a countess, she pulled Carolyn aside and said, "Carolyn, you will be seated next to the king this evening." And I'm thinking, wow, I'm going to be at table number 1. And then she turned to me and said, "Don, you're going to be at table 27. So there was an interesting dialogue between Carolyn and the king. Buy the book and you can read about it.
That's great. And if anybody has any comments or questions, please feel free to open up your microphone and ask them. I will ask you, Don, if you could talk a little bit about maybe some of those things that we might be able to support for better governance as citizens. It occurs to me that maybe something like working for reforms on how districts are designed might be something that we as individual citizens could promote, that might make the situation for people who are running for office a little less partisan.
Well, I could write another book on it, but I'll keep it to a few minutes. There are some political forces out there which are shaping the new reality we're seeing played out on cable news. One, of course, is the money. Anyone paying attention to that race for the 2 Senate positions, hundreds of millions of dollars. The money is coming from somewhere, and they're going to have ultimately an influence. But what's interesting is that before the digital social media, it was the high donors, the political action committees, that really put up the big bucks. But now people can go online and somehow develop a following. And I get so many emails. I spend 80% of my time delete, because if you make a few contributions, you get on everybody's list. And so in a way, that's a more democratic means of raising the money than it is by relying on the high donors, the political action committee, the lobbyists, the special interests. They're all so powerful in Washington, D.C. these days. But the other is the ideology, especially on the far right. Donald Trump has just raised $170 million. For what purpose? To pay for his legal team to continue to challenge the election results. But that's a lot of money to raise. But a lot of it comes from that community that's more far right, where they can tap into unlimited resources. Nobody can do it like Donald Trump. I mean, Mitch McConnell or Chuck Schumer can send out their requests, but no one has anything close to the impact that Trump does when he does this. So the money is a huge force, but also this digital age, social media, online, it's shaping our political culture probably more than anything we've seen in the lifetime of our democracy.
And is that necessarily bad, or is it, I mean, what is,
well,
or do we just not know?
Here's the downside, and we've all seen this. Traditionally, any kind of news reporting was all about facts and information. Today, there's such a malignment in how news is circulating out there, especially on social media. The lies, the misinformation, the attacks. So for people who just want to get to the truth, where does it come from? On cable TV? Maybe hopefully the more traditional TV networks. But even the New York Times, Washington Post are being viewed now as very liberal on the other side and distrustful from that community. So I think the one challenge, and goes beyond just the politics, is how we can have a reporting system that's more reliant on facts and real information, and not just on conspiracies and lies that are shaping how people are thinking across America's heartland these days. I don't know how we regulate that.
Christina.
I tune into Dr. Heather Cox Richardson's daily posts and her videos, and she studies the Constitution and United States government. She says that we should push for something called the Fairness Doctrine that was taken out during the Reagan era. And that's what allowed things like Fox News and things like that not to present facts and the other side. Do you think that that might be something that we can get on board with as citizens to sort of push, is a reinstatement of the Fairness Doctrine?
Yeah, that's a very good idea, and it would be a meaningful step in that direction. I think politically it's going to be difficult unless the Democrats are in full control, because the Fox has a stranglehold on the Republican Party and that, constituent base. So that's the challenge too, because a lot of meaningful measures require some kind of bipartisan support, especially if Republicans control the Senate. So what can we do short of that? Can the president use executive orders? That's going to be another interesting scene in a Biden administration, because I'll tell you, Trump has violated all of the norms in a equal branch. The Congress always had the final say on money, on appropriations, on authorizations, and he's used executive order almost in a dictatorial way. This is what I want to do. But if the Republicans or the Democrats didn't hold him accountable, then he gets away with it. So when Biden comes in, is he going to go back to the traditional norms, or is he going to continue on this path of just issuing executive order? And that's a way to bypass really what Congress's role is.
And Congressman, you said something there earlier about how nobody has been as effective as Donald Trump in activating this base of small contributions added with large donors. And that, to me, is scary, because it means that even if Trump is not a candidate in 2024, there are a lot of people who are going to try to replicate that sort of success.
Yeah, and the interesting question is our system to a point where you just buy elections? I don't think so. Again, because of social media and because of reporting today, Biden's raised a lot of money, but during the primary, he didn't raise a lot of money, but somehow got a following going. And that's it. With honest reporting of the news, you know more about a person's record, their character, and so forth. But again, everything is kind of misrepresented these days. But hopefully, it's not always about buying an election. And in Georgia, it's going to be interesting. and seeing how we might go forward, because so much money is going there. It's going to be more Republican than Democratic money, but the Democrats are raising a lot of money the same way. And that's too bad, because when people stand for election, how they get elected should be a lot more than just money. Their record, their character, what they're proposing as someone who's going to represent a constituency. We're having a lot of changes in our political system our founding fathers could never imagine.
So
I'd just like to say one thing. When you're talking about media, and here I'm going to put in my 2 cents worth regarding the media, because I too have a problem with watching probably anything and everything. So I do my darndest to watch as much Fox News as I can stomach, because I want to find out what's going on the other end of the world. And I also watch MSNBC, I've got to admit. So, but the person that I tend to find is Shepard Smith, who's now on CNBC. He used to be on Fox until he quit after being there for 20 years or 25 years, I think. Anyway, he's on CNBC now at 4 o'clock in the afternoon here. And he is, they proclaim the facts, the news, the truth kind of thing. And I think he does not editorialize. He is very bright, and there might be a little snarkiness on occasion, but it's more to the point of who he brings on as his aides and his other reporters. He's just a really brilliant fella, and I would recommend seeing him as a difference to the other ones, including Rachel Maddow, including Chris Wallace, and so on and so forth.
That's a good point you made.
So there are a few people who are obviously, and organizations. ProPublica seems like an organization that's trying to lay out facts and not color them with opinion. I just wonder, Congressman, if you have any thoughts about the move to amend idea, the idea of having an amendment to the Constitution that would declare that money is not a form of free speech, as an effort to try to blunt the protections that campaign donations have had from the Supreme Court.
Yeah, well, it's the Supreme Court that set the rules, or has removed the rules for contributions, especially from high donors and PACs. I mean, so much money is poured in, and they have a way of skirting whatever rules exist out there that's influencing not only elections, but going into lobbyists to achieve certain objectives if they're corporations or whatever. And we're again going to need legislation that's going to require bipartisan support and drafted in a way that won't get knocked down by the Supreme Court. Now it's a conservative Supreme Court once again. But again, it's one thing to have money raised in digital. These are small donations. That's kind of what democracy is about, small donations. But the reality is you should get your donations from the constituency you represent, not a nationwide following. But that high donor money does have profound influence in legislation. And lobbyists and special interests and political action committees, they don't need to influence all 435 House members. What they want, whether it's bank regulation or fossil fuels or whatever, comes down to one committee. And there might be 23 or so Democrats and Republicans on that committee. So they have to buy and own the members of that committee to get their objectives achieved. And that's how, and I've seen it both when I was in Congress and for many years in DC afterwards, the profound influence that these political action committees have on legislation by simply showing up at those fundraisers, getting the congressman's ear as they handing them a $5,000 check. So that's what we need to regulate. And if I were a congressman today, one bill I would introduce, to follow up on my point, is to disallow members on the committee to receive any contributions from someone who has a stake in that committee's business. In other words, if you're representing the banking industry, you cannot contribute to anyone who serves on that committee.
And that sounds like the kind of measure which, if difficult to pass, it certainly would not be difficult to promote in the wider community. None of us, and probably nobody on either side of the spectrum, is going to object to the idea that people shouldn't get their votes bought. Eleanor.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to come back to the idea of civility and the notion that fundamentally our system of government is based on the notion of compromise. And so at one level, I don't have a problem with the extreme position, because that, balances the discussion that leads to the compromise that becomes the law. I realize this is the idealized version in this day and age, but well, deep in my heart, I'm an idealist, I guess. So it seems to me that that when compromise became a dirty word, and you had to hold to your position no matter how quickly the ship was sinking, that it makes that system nearly impossible to carry forward. And I guess my real question is, in this day and age when the highest office in the land speaks in grossly uncivil terms to anyone and everyone, and if you display civility, you get slapped around. Is there any way to help bring back that notion of balance and of coming together, to talk together, compromise, in order to move us forward?
Yeah,
I want you to cheer me up.
Yeah. Thank you. What you say is exactly what Joe Biden's trying to project right now, is civility, trust, bipartisanship, and so forth. Now, how that plays out is going to be another issue, but at the moment, he's trying to unify in that respect. But what's interesting is when you look closely at our founding fathers, and I've read the book on Alexander Hamilton and others, boy, the lack of civility in those days, the tribal politics between the Federalist and the Jeffersonian part of the political divide, they all sides had their own news propaganda machines, which were influencing, and even one got to be so horrible Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton had that duel. And they had a big divide over whether there should be a big central government or states have more rights and so forth. But the interactions you read about was really quite amazing. And yet they managed to come together to make the necessary compromises that built the foundation of our democracy. So I think a lot of times it's the differences and our capability of getting beyond them. And that gets back to moral leadership, that the leaders do have a sense of character and trust, do want to serve the common good, the national interest over political gain or feisty bipartisanship. It's whether the leaders can rise to the occasion. And, when you see Mitch McConnell, first thing he said when Obama was elected, he's not going to get anything from me. He just slammed the door shut. Well, that's not how democracy functions.
Well, and that's where, I think Mitch McConnell is the most evil person in the country. Sorry to be straightforward about it, because how is it I mean, I understand how, but how do we let him get away with being able to stop anything from moving forward? I mean, I do think that was part of what happened in the last election. I think a sufficient number of us stood up and said, we don't want this anymore. But, you know, he's one senator from one state. He's controlling the country. And that's not the way it should be.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting because he seemed to have a resentment for Barack Obama, but he and Joe Biden have served in the Senate a long time. And I think they have a good relationship. And possibly Biden can pick up the phone and talk to him and see how things can work out. But there's been no one, probably in the history of our country in the Senate, who's been as partisan, who has been as combative as Mitch McConnell. So whether he backs up a little bit, and again, it's just not the person. He represents the Republican delegation in the Senate. And if he was unacceptable, his actions heavily criticized, then they wouldn't vote for him to be leader. But boy, he is strongly in charge of the Republican Senate, and he's not going to be discarded anytime soon.
But any leader involved who calls for moral or ethical behavior at least gets that into the conversation.
Yeah.
So
well,
that's going to be
Mitt Romney's the example of that. Reed, he is a very honorable person. He's got a moral compass that leads him through his political career. I wish he could stand up as an alternative to Mitch McConnell, but that doesn't exist at the moment. The Republicans are solidly behind McConnell at the moment. And then, of course, we're going to see Trump in the afterlife and how he might influence the political scene. Right now, those 70 million followers are solidly behind him. And you know he's not going to play a unifying, being constructive role. So a lot of political drama going forth for us, that's for sure.
Well, I want to thank you. Oh, Karen, did you have a comment?
Well, personally, I feel like our democratic republic is just holding on by its fingernails right now, to be quite honest with you. But we were talking about, you know, Citizens United and political action committees just giving unlimited amounts of money. And but I think prior to that is that the lobbyist, you know, the lobbyist amount since, gosh, 1980 has just skyrocketed. And I visited Washington, D.C. once, and we were in a restaurant, and it was like we got to watch it in action at a, you know, lobbyist talking to congressmen at a table in a restaurant, and the arm twisting. And I think that the money corruption has been going on long before political action committees. So what was your experience with lobbyists?
Well, it's more powerful and sophisticated today than when I was there. But you should realize that you have lobbyists that cover the political spectrum. Now, let's take let me give you one issue. Religious freedom versus gay rights. Both sides are well represented. It's not the gay and lesbian community has lots of money, but boy, they have influence. And when the Democrats took over the House 2 years ago, they got a bill passed, I think, without maybe one dissenting Democrat, that expanded gay rights, often at the expense of religious freedom, because there is a room for compromise. And I've worked for the last few years, I guess, as a lobbyist for a coalition that includes gays and evangelicals. Now, these are kind of the moderates in both, but we're trying to find a way on legislation that would protect religious freedoms, but remove discrimination, and find that mid position. But if the Democrats control, they're not for compromise on this at all. They'll pass that bill again next year. If the religious right, they have their own bill, which has language that's clearly discriminatory towards gay and lesbians. So this is a coalition, and been meeting now for 8 or 9 years, and it's mostly supported by the Mormon Church, and they got legislation like that in Utah, but trying to navigate in a way that protects religious freedom and then removes discrimination. So there are some lobbying efforts that are worthy of what they do, but there's too much mischief all across the spectrum. And let me make one more comment, because I should wind down. When I last ran for the Senate, I ran for the Senate twice, and I had been out of office for 6 years or so. Now, this is on the left side, not on the right. Labor unions, environmental groups, pro-abortion groups, gay groups, and others. They wanted to interview, and when they interview, they ask you 10 or 12 questions. Yes or no? Do you support this? Do you support that? And you want to get their support. So yes, 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 yes. And you've locked yourself in. Mm-hmm. Now the right has, on the other side, they have the same groups, the NRA and so forth. And what happens through these interviews, and they've all got records, when you go back on this issue I've just talked about, if you sat down with the gay lesbian group and committed to everything, there's no way you can support a compromised position. So this is another evil force in our political system. The special interests across the spectrum are getting people so committed to their agenda, there's no more room for compromise or legislation.
Do you actually look at, like, if, somebody says, oh, how do you feel about abortion? And they, you poll the United States, and some say, okay, we are for safe abortion, okay. But how does a congressman, do they look at what the constituents want, or do they want to look at what the lobbyist and special interest wants?
A good question, and why you should buy the book, because I have a chapter on it. At the time, I was inconsequential. I was fairly young, but the Congress was at a stalemate on this abortion issue, and it was so-called the Hyde Amendment. How you can allow for some abortions, and we're talking about federally funded abortions, not about the Roe versus Wade, but federally funded. And it was at a total stalemate. And it went on this for 3 or 4 months. They couldn't get the bill out of committee. Well, at the time, Senator Magnuson from Washington State was chairman of that committee that had jurisdiction, and they were at a stalemate. Anyway, I didn't want to be presumptuous, but I was a Christian Democrat, so I started calling some Republicans and just getting a dialogue, and I eventually came up with some language. And I took it over to Senator Magnuson, and eventually that was a breakthrough on what has been the Hyde Amendment, which is still in effect today. So again, there was a little space for doing something. And I thought that's one of my great accomplishments. The last thing I wanted to do was send out a press release or make a statement. Look what I did.
Yeah, right.
Because I didn't want either side to know what I did.
Exactly. Yeah, I get that. You're kind of in the hot seat.
So the book is A Higher Calling, Faith and Politics in the Public Square, and it's by Don Bonker with David Applefield, as we said earlier. Thank you very much for your time, and
thank you so much, Reed.
Come by the Senior Community Center anytime.
I'll come by with my pen so I can sign the books.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.